I think we can start now. Okay. I have the great honor to welcome you for the final and concluding keynote of the conference Futuring Critical Theory. First and foremost, I want to thank Didier Fassin for accepting the invitation to close the conference with this lecture. He will be commented by Klaus Günther, whom I also want to warmly welcome. Before I briefly introduce both of them, both of whom are surely very well known to you, I would like to add a little comment regarding the topic of the conference, the possibilities of futuring critical theory. We can mark blind spots of critical theory and try to overcome them. Therefore, we can work on concepts of critical theory, as has been done here. And we can broaden the theoretical tools by referring to other theoretical approaches, traditions, or concepts, which has been done as well. So to say, we can recompose critical theory. What we will experience in the next 1.5 hours describes another take on the task of futuring critical theory. To return to the somehow neglected traditions in the early work of the Institute for Social Research. On the one hand, to refer to the empirical research as it has been done prominently in the beginning of the Institute, and on the other hand, to refer to works of legal scholars, as we remember Karl Grünberg, the first director of the Institute, or later Otto Kirchheimer and Franz Neumann. This in mind, I will try to shortly introduce Didier Fassin, which is hard regarding his numerous affiliations and publications. Didier Fassin is a professor to the annual chair in the public health at the Collège de France in Paris. He's also James D. Wolfenson Professor of Social Sciences at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and a Director of Studies at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. 2021, he was elected to the Academia Europaea. His main area of research is political and medical anthropology. In particular, he has written about forms of inequality and injustice in France, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America. Didier Fassin was founding director of the Interdisciplinary Research Institute for the Social Sciences at the French Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, and a former vice president of Médecins Sans Frontières. Didier Fassin has several honorary doctorates and was awarded numerous prizes, including the gold medal in anthropology at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. In 2016, he held the Adorno Lectures on his approach to political and moral anthropology of life in Frankfurt. His manifold publications include this book coming out of this life, A Critical User's Manual, 2018, A Time for Critique, edited with Bernard Harcourt, 2019, and Enforcing Order and Anthropology of Urban Policing. Klaus Günther is professor of theory of law, criminal law, and criminal procedural law at the Institute of Criminal Justice and Philosophy of Law, and principal investigator of the Research Center Normative Orders at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. Since 2023, he chairs the Academic Advisory Board of the Fritz Bauer Institute. He is a member of the Research Council at the Institute for Social Research, as all of you might know. I welcome both of them and look forward to the lecture and discussions.
Thank you, Doris, for your presentation. Thank you, Klaus, for your forthcoming comments. Thank you, Stefan, for your invitation and all those who organized this extraordinary conference. Being the last is a challenge not only because people are in the audience are exhausted, but also because having heard the other talks, one would like to rewrite one's own, which I didn't have time to do. On your program, the title was about force of order, which refers to a previous work that I did and an ongoing reflection that I have on the police. This is what I was asked to do, and I preferred to do something else on what I consider one of the most pressing questions of our time, and also what is my most recent research, the political violence of borders. It is an immense honor to be invited to the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the Institute for Social Research, not only because of the significance of the event, but also because I'm not a member of the community of philosophers, but I understood that other speakers could be in that situation as well, nor am I an expert on the Frankfurt School. With the honor, though, comes the anxiety of finding myself among eminent colleagues and having to take up the challenge thus formulated by the organizers to determine where critical theory stands and to reorient it in the light of the existential issues of our time. I hope not to disappoint you too much on both the present and the future. Perhaps more than any other school of thought, critical theory has been marked by forced displacement. In the early 1930s, the barely created Institute for Social Research was closed, and its professors had to leave Nazi Germany. The director, Max Horkheimer, moved to Geneva, then to New York, as did, among others, Friedrich Pollock and Erich Fromm, while Theodor Adorno went to Oxford and later also to New York, a city which Walter Benjamin, who had earlier fled to Paris, never reached. It is therefore all the more remarkable that the question of the forcibly displaced has been almost absent of their critique of Western societies and capitalism. Jewish academics like them, among whom several went to Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, starting with Albert Einstein, were not the only Jews discriminated against to flee the Nazis. Before the Second World War, approximately 400,000 had left Germany and Austria, 1/4 of them to the United States, and they were of all social conditions, very few having the chance to secure a position comparable to the one they had earlier, or even to be accepted in the country of their choice. Indeed, at the Conference of Evian, convened by Franklin Roosevelt, the delegates of 32 nations could not find an agreement about how to allocate refugees among them. Persecuted at home, German and Austrian Jews were unwelcome elsewhere. After the war, there were 40 million displaced persons across Europe, mostly former inmates from Nazi camps and people fleeing the Soviet Union, Soviet army. Repatriated in the, many didn't want to be repatriated in the countries they came from. But again, Western nations were not keen on receiving them. This time, the United States were reluctant to accept their share of refugees, and only 3 years after the end of the war did Harry Truman sign the Displaced Person Act. Yet, in the writings of the Frankfurt School, one can hardly find any sign of this tragedy which affected its very members. Thus, in Adorno's Minima Moralia, despite the evocative subtitle, Reflection on the Damaged Life, the only references to displaced person concern intellectual immigration and intellectual émigrés, and their cultural mutilation for being in a foreign country. more generally in the works of the so-called first generation of the Frankfurt School, it is as if their elitist understanding of the condition of migrants and refugees was too self-referential, that is, seen through their own experience of exile, to embrace the broader and gloomier perspective, let alone a global one, or as if their critical theory could not integrate it, perhaps because these disqualified and disgraced people arriving in the United States did not in the least fit their lofty vision of emancipation. By contrast, in the same period, Hannah Arendt, who had also emigrated to New York, famously dedicated in The Origins of Totalitarianism the long chapter, The Decline of the Nation-State and the End of Human Rights, to the importance for political theory of the growing number of stateless people since the First World War. She called them those who persecution had called undesirable, who became the indésirable of Europe, as she writes. In fairness, the Frankfurt School was not alone in showing little interest in these questions. And besides Arendt's illuminating intuitions, moral and political philosophy did not pay attention to them either until at least the 1980s, when normative theories began to flourish after Michael Walzer's pioneer work in his Spheres of Justice, where he argues for the right of a nation to decide who it will let in, even if it is on ethnic or religious grounds, except when they are refugees, still with some limits. Interestingly, it was Jürgen Habermas who first criticized this communitarian and sovereigntist position, finding it one-sided because it only considered the perspective of the receiving community, and dangerous because it privileged illegitimate identity-based criteria. Many debates followed, notably between David Miller and Joseph Carens. But none of these theories adopted what could have been a critical theory approach to the topic, that is, first, considering the world as it is and not as it ought to be, therefore working with the social sciences. Second, not taking for granted the way the world is, therefore examining the social forces at play to account for it. If one accepts the two lines of this very succinct definition I just gave of critical theory, my intention here is precisely to partake in a conversation with critical theorists, first, from the perspective of the social sciences, and second, focusing on the social forces at play. I defend the idea that the social sciences provide a unique empirical material to build a critical theory of these social forces. This endeavor may be seen as a modest contribution to a disavowal of the late Bruno Latour's provocative diagnosis in 2003, critical theory died out long ago. Paraphrasing a probably apocryphal quote by Mark Twain, one could reply that the report of its death has been greatly exaggerated. If I started this lecture with the evocation of the Institute for Social Research in a time of the displacement in and from Europe, before and after the Second World War, it is because a parallel is evident with the present situation of displacement to and throughout Europe. In the prologue titled A Tale of Two Ships of his What Do We Owe to Refugees, David Owen draws this parallel between, based on two well-known stories. In May 1939, the ocean liner St. Louis left Hamburg with 937 passengers on board, almost all Jews, who had been permitted to disembark in Cuba as they waited for their visas for the United States. When it arrived at Havana, a right-wing campaign convinced the Cuban government not to accept the disembarking while the US government argued that its quota of refugees had been reached. The ship had to return to Europe, where its passengers were assigned to Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But in the following years, half of those who had remained on the European continent died in concentration camps. In June 2018, the cargo Aquarius, run by SOS Méditerranée and Médecins Sans Frontières, with 629 people aboard, rescued from shipwrecks, mostly sub-Saharan Africans, including 11 young children and 7 pregnant women, was forbidden by the Italian right-wing government to dock in its harbor. This highly publicized event took place in a context of rising nationalism and xenophobia in Italy, exacerbated by the refusal of most of the other countries, Germany being an exception, to take their share of the refugees coming from the south or the east. Paradoxically, at the time, the crossings of the Mediterranean had plummeted to their lowest in a decade, meaning that the Italian decision was a purely ideological gesture. After the French government also denied the boat access to its ports, the newly appointed Spanish socialist government accepted it. The context of the two events and the becoming of the vessel's passengers are dramatically different, but both raise the question of how states respond to those who seek protection. 85 years ago, Jews threatened by the Nazis left Europe on the eve of a genocide. Today, Sudanese fleeing civil war, Somalis, the Shabab, Afghans, the Taliban, Iranians, the Mullah, others, extreme poverty or lack of future, come to Europe. The direction of the journeys is opposite, but the problem of asylum remains despite the 1951 Geneva Convention related to refugees, which was supposed to solve it. But was it? In fact, this international agreement was far from having the universalist definition and field of relevance that is often assumed. It was a document written by Europeans for Europeans. The Global South was excluded of its conception and its applicability, and many countries refused to sign for this reason. Only the 1967 New York Protocol gave it a worldwide extension, yet even under these conditions, 44 states, that is almost 1/4 of the total, remain non-signatories to the convention, mostly in the Middle East, as well as South and Southeast Asia. My analysis is grounded in the research I have conducted with the sociologist Anne-Claire de Fossé over the past 5 years at the border between Italy and France in the Alps, doing more than 200 interviews of migrants and refugees, police and military officers, state and local representatives, volunteers, participating for hundreds of hours in various activities in solidarity, such as rescue operation in the mountain and medical assistance at the shelter in the valley, and consulting archives, documents, newspapers. It is thus an enriched ethnography. It tries to account for a phenomenon, namely the fate of the almost 50 million externally displaced persons, among whom hundreds of thousands are en route to or through Europe each year, a phenomenon that I consider to be a signature of the 21st century. Among the persons we interviewed, 2 main routes led to Western Europe. Those coming from sub-Saharan Africa crossed the Sahara, then Maghreb, finally the Mediterranean. Those coming from the Middle East take the Balkans route from Greece to Italy via Croatia, or more northward to Austria via Hungary. Those coming from Morocco and Algeria used to cross the Mediterranean, but they now consider it too dangerous, and they take a much longer route, flying to Istanbul and continuing along the Balkans, where they nevertheless face other hardships. There is a cruel irony in the fact that whereas a flight from Conakry to Paris lasts 6 hours and 15 minutes, and from Kabul to London, 7 hours and 39 minutes, it takes months and even years to cover these distances with permanent exposures to multiple risks of all sorts. In our sample of more than 1,000 migrants and refugees we studied quantitatively, 72% of Middle Eastern have traveled more than 1 year, and even more than 2 years for half of them. And almost among the sub-Saharans, 85% had left home more than 1 year before, and again, even more than 2 years for half of them. Each leg of these journeys, whether from the south or from the east, was strewn with scores of deaths, the more lethal being the southern route. In the past decades, 1,300 deaths have been recorded in the Sahara and 22,000 in the Mediterranean, according to the official Missing Migrants Project, which recognizes that these figures are greatly underestimated, as many disappear without leaving traces. What I would like to show is how the obstacles, the abuses, the losses are narrowly linked with European policies. At the shelter, having noticed that he was isolated, silent, sad, and apparently handicapped, I had multiple conversations with a young man from Nigeria. He told me his story. Several months before, he had hurriedly fled his village with his 2-year-old son after a Boko Haram attack had decimated his family. He had hidden in the bush, and thinking that it was impossible to stay where he used to live, had gone to Niger. In Agadez, he found a smuggler to transport him through the Sahara. The pickup with 24 passengers broke down in the desert. For 3 days, they were abandoned without water. His child died. Later in Libya, they were kidnapped by a militia who retained them in an empty building. To be freed, they had to pay a ransom, which he could not. He was requested to call his family to send the money, which he said was impossible since they had all been killed. So his guard beat him up and forced him to work for them. The same scene repeated every day. Once he was not feeling well and could not stand up. One of the guards battered him and pushed him over from the 3rd floor. He broke his leg. As he tried to escape, staggering, the man went down, took his vehicle, and hit him, leaving him unconscious. An African man found him and took him to his small one-room house. During 2 months, he had excruciating pain and did not receive treatment. Being undocumented, it was too risky for him to go to the hospital. Countrymen eventually proposed him to come with them as they were going to cross the Mediterranean. Their inflatable dinghy had 57 other passengers aboard. After a few hours, the engine stalled. They remained 2 days adrift before being rescued by a humanitarian vessel. He finally reached Italy, took several trains northward, and close to the French border, he limped alone through the Alps, taking perilous paths to avoid the police and the military who surveilled day and night the pass between the two countries. After 20 hours of this strenuous walk, he arrived at the shelter. There he could call his wife and be relieved as he learned that she was still alive. He received analgesic, got crutches, so a surgeon obtained advice for what to do next. Although defining plans was onerous for him, since he knew no one in Europe and had never even imagined that he could leave his village one day. This is one of the many stories I collected, all different, but all marked by hardships and suffering. The official reading of such stories by European authorities and institutions combine reassuring common sense assertions about the ignorance of people who would stay home had they known the tribulation they would have to face on their journey, the dangers of natural elements, and the culpability of smugglers. But a critical analysis proves otherwise. Obviously, this young man thought he had no other choice than leaving his village, and as he lived near the northern border of Nigeria, no other option than going to a supposedly safer Niger. But it happens that Niger, which is the main transit route of sub-Saharan migrants northward, has become much more dangerous since 2015, when the European Union, as part of its politic of externalization of border control, financially supported the Nigerian government in exchange of a tougher policy against illegal immigration. The legislation criminalizing smugglers, hosts, and even migrants was passed. Viewed from the EU side, this cooperation is a success. The measured flow of persons heading north significantly declined in the following years. Seen from the NGO's side, the consequences are higher risk for those crossing the desert, since smugglers take routes distant from the main road to avoid the police, with for results that their passengers cannot be rescued by other vehicles in case of breakdown. In the 2 years after the passing of the new law, the number of crossings which was counted, was reduced threefold. But the number of deaths had an eightfold increase, both crossing and death being underestimated due to the clandestine routes they take. Similar policies of externalized border control were implemented in the Maghreb, turning a blind eye on police practices in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, which consist of harassing migrants and refugees, brutalizing them, eventually deporting them in the desert without water. And as for Tunisia, even ignoring its president's xenophobic statement, which encouraged pogroms in various parts of the country, the EU pressured these governments to interrupt migration northward, offering in return financial assistance. As for Libya, where the destruction of the previous regime by the French and British military intervention facilitated the multiplication of militia and the circulation of weaponry, the EU provided its new authorities patrol boats and trained its coast guards to intercept migrants and refugees before they got into international waters, knowing that for those caught, it would mean imprisonment, beating, sometimes ransoming or torture. Sometimes airplanes of the EU agency Frontex would even give Libyans the geolocalization of the small boats to help them practice illegal pushbacks. Therefore, as smugglers knew that their makeshift crafts would be destroyed by the rescue vessels, they used increasingly poor material. This neocolonization of Africa by the EU or by individual European countries such as France, Britain, and Italy via the soft power of money and influence concerns many other countries on the continent. It is not indifferent that these have natural resources such as oil, gas, uranium, and other minerals, the exploitation of which benefits European companies and local authorities in a win-win game based on corruption at the expense of both national and displaced populations. This is an example of the combination of capitalism and neocolonialism Gorminder discussed yesterday. This externalization of border control delegates to African countries the dirty work, to use Everett's phrase, of border control for European countries who seemingly keep their hands clean. The elimination of migrants and refugees by homicide, dehydration, or drowning, the normalization of physical violence, sexual abuse, ransoming by armed groups and the police, the denial of access to protection under the Geneva Convention are consequently attributed to African formal and informal institutions, while the EU can pretend that its policy only has for objective to reduce the number of people taking risks, when in fact it increases the risks for those who have to go, most of the time because they think they have no alternative. But the externalization of border control renders invisible what would be otherwise intolerable. But is it really so? Does the EU not accept similar practices on its own territory? Displaced person from Afghanistan, Iran, or Iraq would certainly answer, it does. On the Balkans route, two countries are well known for their police infamous practices, Greece and Croatia. All migrants and refugees from the Middle East we interviewed told us about illegal pushbacks of small boats in the Aegean Sea and showed us videos displaying scenes of men in underwear on the Turkish banks of the Evros River after they'd been battered and chased by the Greek police. They gave us pictures they had taken of themselves or of others with blistered lines on their back, swollen face, bleeding nose, black eyes, as a result of police violence on the occasion of their multiple attempts, up to 40 for some of them, to cross the Croatian border. And they recounted how they had many times been dispossessed of their telephone and money, ordered to take off their clothes and harshly beaten with rods, frightened with bullets being fired close to their body as they were lying on the ground, sometimes marked with a large black cross painted on their shaved head. On both borders, Greek and Croatian, reports of the Council of Europe's Committee for the Prevention of Torture and Inhuman or Degrading Treatment and of the Border Violence Monitoring Network leave no doubt about the banality of these sinister practices based on brutalization, humiliation, and terrorization, which sometimes cause death. The right-wing governments of both countries deny the existence of such practices, and European institutions implicitly support the policies that underlie them. Despite convergent public reports attesting the abuses, 3 years ago, the German president of the European Commission congratulated Greece, which she called the shield of Europe, for its border management and announced an extra support of 700 million euros for it. While 2 years ago, the French head of state, on the verge of becoming the temporary president of the EU, complimented Croatia for its border control and assured that he would defend its joining the Schengen space. In other words, considering that these two countries are the main points of entry in the Union, Europe assumes the grave mistreatment they commit on displaced persons, who for the great majority had been persecuted in their home country for their ethnicity, their religion, their sexual orientation, or their political opposition, and while being entitled to asylum, are once more victims of abuses. In a certain way, this ruthless politics conducted at the margin of Europe presents similarity with what described in Africa. At work are the same normalization and invisibilization of violence against migrants and refugees and violations of their rights. Indeed, in the general public, who is aware of what happens every day near the river between Greece and Turkey, in the woods between Croatia and Bosnia or Serbia, and within the detention centers of both countries? When have these practices made the news? In the same way as border control is externalized in Africa, it is marginalized in Europe. In both cases, the police have not only discretionary power, which is almost a definition of law enforcement, but they also have arbitrary power almost without limit. Suffice to see how men and women from Eritrea, Sudan, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq are victims of their violence in the north of France, some of them being beaten, kicked, slapped, threatened, arrested, while every 48 hours, for legal reasons, their tents are removed and often destroyed, sometimes with their modest possession inside, practices that, again, remain unseen due to the prohibition of the presence of volunteers and journalists. The paradox being here that displaced persons are forbidden not to enter, but to leave France. But it is not simply that the abuse of power goes along with its impunity when it affects migrants and refugees. To whom could they complain? It is also that human and technological resources keep increasing. Frontex's budget was 19 million euros in 2006, 254 million euros 10 years later, 750 million euros last year. EU growing financial support for both externalization and marginalization of border control go mostly to the repressive apparatus. Most European countries develop their own systems of walls, fences, barbed wire, supposed to prevent the crossing of their border, but actually making it simply more dangerous. 5 years ago, at the border where we work, there were 50 officers. They received 180 military as reinforcement, including anti-terrorist units with night vision goggles, assault rifles, four-wheel drive, snowmobile, drones. In total, more than 200 agents for approximately 4,000 who cross the border each year. That is, on average, a little more than 10 persons daily. What takes place at borders is part of a broader phenomenon of which France is an extreme example of policiarization of social life, with the police being increasingly militarized in terms of weaponry, vehicles, and body protection. For a long time, and most notably after the Second World War, European countries needed for their economic development and later reconstructions migrants that often formed the lowest stratum of their social classes. For those seeking asylum, the refugee status was not even necessary. An employment contract was enough. Today, and actually for most of the past half-century, despite the perspective of demographic decline in the EU, most migrants and refugees have become unwanted, according to Michael Marus's famous expression. Indeed, from a utilitarian perspective, they are deemed economically superfluous. But this assumption is false, since those who end up illegally in a host country do contribute to the labor force as irregular workers who are less costly and more docile, and several economic sectors are greatly dependent on them, notably construction, catering, clothing, cleaning, personal care. This dual process is what Nicolas de Genova designates in the United States as a dialectic of exclusion-inclusion through a revolving door by which Latin American migrants are repeatedly rejected at the border until they succeed in entering and get immediately integrated in the US economy. So in a nutshell, when migrants were openly needed, they were part of an exploited proletariat, and when they began to be regarded as redundant, a minority became part of an overexploited sub-proletariat in specific sectors, while the majority were simply discarded unless they could be recognized as refugees and join the general workforce, often in underqualified jobs. However, this political economy analysis cannot be the end of the story. It does not account for the death drive of Moroccan and Croatian police when arresting migrants and refugees. Brutalization, humiliation, terrorization are unnecessary when pushing them back. This degrading of which European authorities are accomplices through their silence and even support is in excess. Could be seen as a form of accursed shared in the sense of Georges Bataille's expression. Displaced people are not only unwanted, they are undesirable. It means that they are not just not desired, they are not even worthy of being desired. This distinction is crucial because it suggests that it is not only that they are thought to be without value, that is economic value, but also that they are deemed without worthiness, that is as human beings. This unworthiness authorizes a lack of consideration for their life and for their person, the possibility of contempt and cruelty. It makes it possible for the Tunisian police to abandon women and children in the desert without water, or for the Greek police to strip men naked before beating them up and forcing them to jump in the river as some beg that they do not know how to swim. And women die in the Sahara with their children, and men drown in the Evros River. To apprehend this combination of political economy and death drive, of utilitarian worldview a la Gary Becker and pleasure of causing suffering as Nietzsche has it, it may need to revive the alliance of Marx and Freud that characterized the theories of the early Institute for Social Research. But there's still more to it. That migrants and refugees on the southern route are blacks in countries where racism has long been entrenched, such as Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya. And that on the eastern route, they are Muslims in countries with dominantly Christian populations, such as Greece and Croatia. While by contrast, in Bosnia, where Islam is the main religion, they were much better accepted, is not indifferent. It is indicative of what Tendayi Achume calls racial borders, and one must add religious borders. Racism and intolerance underlie xenophobia towards displaced people in Europe. Not that these would be the only reasons for rejection and abuse, of which Sub-Saharan and Middle Eastern countries are not outdone, but the reification of others through race or religion facilitates their dehumanization. Western Europe has not been spared by this essentialization, even if its manifestations were usually less extreme. In France, xenophobia with racist and Islamophobic undertones is fueled by the far right, by a right more and more indistinguishable from the far right, and by a center right increasingly similar to what one used to call the right not so long ago. With 2/3 of the French police in activity voting for the far right, testimonies collected in the shelter show that the encounter with border officers can be a painful experience for displaced persons. The politics of life of the EU, as I have described it until now, has two sides, which can be analyzed in terms of Walter Benjamin's critique of violence. On the one hand, life is understood as the mere fact of being alive, which is what dozens of thousands of migrants and refugees have lost when they drowned in the Mediterranean by lack of a safe route to reach Europe. The corresponding politics of life is a politics of abandonment. It officially began in 2014 with the end of the program Mare Nostrum, which had rescued 150,000 shipwrecked, but which the EU refused to fund. It was replaced by the Frontex operation Triton, less in charge of search and rescue than of border surveillance. This meant a shift from humanitarianism to policing. On the other hand, life is apprehended as a qualified life of human beings, the violation of which has been experienced by dozens of thousands of migrants and refugees at the Greek and Croatian borders, and in every place where they have been debased and devalued. The corresponding politics of life is a politics of indignity. It unofficially started at the end of 2015 when the Balkans route, which had been designed as a secure transit corridor for those mostly Syrians and Afghans who were fleeing their country, was closed by the construction of a wall at the Hungarian border. Soon after, other similar initiatives followed in neighboring countries, with Greece and Croatia becoming obsessed by the crossing of their borders. There are thus two European politics of life when it comes to displaced persons in search of protection or better life. One is one that passively condemns to death, the other one that actively degrades the person. Paraphrasing Michel Foucault, their maxim could be respectively, let die and revile the living. In the case of the delegation of border to sub-Saharan and Maghrebi countries to the pictures, to this picture, the two politics of life are in fact combined. Migrants and refugees are left in the desert and after having been abused. But Europe is not exempt of such combination. Thus, on the 26th of February this year, a ship which had sailed from Izmir with 200 passengers aboard ran aground on the coast of Calabria, only a few meters from the beach. That's a different story from the one Athena evoked last night. Investigation showed that an EU aircraft had reported signs of distress of the Italian authorities, but instead of the Coast Guard vessels of the Guardia Costiera accustomed to this operation, two patrol boats of the Guardia di Finanza were sent to intercept the ship, and not prepared for such bad weather, they had to return to its port. Policing had prevailed over rescuing. 94 people died. This was part of a policy of the right-wing government to dissuade crossings of the Mediterranean by making them more dangerous. Indeed, days before, a law that had been passed forbidding humanitarian vessels to undertake more than one rescue at a time and imposing them to disembark in remote ports so as to reduce their capacity to assist boats in distress. Two measures which considerably reduced the possibility of rescuing makeshift crafts whose engines were actually expected to stall after only a few hours afloat. After the shipwreck, which caused some emotion in the public, especially in Italy, contrary to the Italian President of the Republic, who paid tribute to the victims by going to the stadium where the coffins had been arranged, the far-right President of the Council decided not to honor them of her presence. To the disrespect of the living, she added the disregard for the dead. Such indifference to both the living and the dead has become the rule as news of shipwrecks multiply. Some attempt to combat it in the same way as humanitarian organizations charter vessels to rescue the living at sea. Citizens strive to give a name, a history, and a dignified grave to the shipwrecked. At the entrance of the cemetery of Lampedusa, where so many unknown migrants and refugees have been buried, one can read the beginning of Emily Dickinson's poem, Bereavement in Their Death, to feel, whom we have never seen, a vital kinsmanship import, our souls and theirs between, for strangers strangers do not mourn. The founders of the Institute for Social Research did not allow much space in their theories to include the displaced person of their time. 1 century later, as is looming what we should stop calling a migrant crisis or refugee crisis, because it is in fact a moral and political crisis of the Western world, the question remains of which space their successors will make to it. As I said earlier, I believe it is a defining question of our time. The analysis of this question is often formulated in terms of fortress Europe, expression referring to the closure of borders to migrants and refugees. As I have tried to show until now, this is not incorrect. But what is at play is more profound and more worrying. The politics of abandonment and the politics of indignity that I have described is of a different nature. The disrespect of the living and the disregard for the dead is a distinct matter. They call for other interpretations. I suggest 2 concepts which I freely adapt from Axel Honneth. Social pathology, to which Axel has dedicated several of his writings, is actually a common thread in the history of the Frankfurt School. Having myself been very suspicious of any organicist theory of society, as well as of the multiple forms of psychologization of collectives, which have flourished in the social sciences since the 19th century, I've long been reluctant to think of pathologies of the social. Yet, in a time of generalized abuse of displaced people, which is simultaneously orchestrated and ignored by Europe, with the rise of far-right parties and the success of xenophobia across the continent, it may be necessary to think about situations and processes like the ones I have described as a pathologization of the social, refusing then to reduce contemporary predicaments to a mere question of justice. In that regard, it is significant that John Rawls, who has been the most influential philosopher on justice, has never written on migrants and refugees except in a footnote of the Law of the Peoples. The dehumanization of others is a dehumanization of oneself. Recognition, which has probably been Axel's major contribution to social critique, is an important response, albeit not the only one, to this pathology of the social. It opposes the reification of displaced people via race, ethnicity, religion, or merely foreignness in the country where they seek protection, which ironically and sadly is the same denial of who they are as the one they previously experienced in their country, which was the source of their persecution. It renders almost impossible the sort of abuse of which they are victims at the border and the kind of complicity states have developed with their criminal police. It is indeed a way of seeing the other as oneself, or perhaps in Paul Ricoeur's terms, oneself as other. Diagnosing a pathology affecting one's society and providing a solution through the recognition of others contributes to what Robin referred to last night as solidarity. And I have seen this solidarity at work at the border between Italy and France, where the acts of rescuing people in the mountain and hosting them in a shelter have gone beyond humanitarianism to a praxis of denouncing repressive policies and policing, thus building a concrete resistance, the sort of utopia Eric Wright praised. But both the diagnosis of the pathology and the recognition of others have in common to be a one-sided view, and Enrique Dussel's lecture, Eurocentrism and Modernity, delivered here in Frankfurt 3 decades ago, still resonates. Indeed, what do we know of the way displaced persons see what is done against them, or even for them, about their torturers and their helpers, about their experience of their journey. To listen to their side of the story supposes to revert the perspective. Ethnographers may contribute to it, they are used to doing so, yet they transcribe, they translate, they interpret, and something is lost in this process. Still, they listen to those who would have no voice otherwise because they are simply not listened to. However, some do have a voice that is heard. They are poets, novelists, writers, artists, who convey their perspective on displacement and exile. Half a century ago, George Steiner wrote, "It seems proper that those who create art in a civilization of quasi-barbarism, which has made so many homeless, which has torn up so many tongues and people by the root, should themselves be poets unhoused and wanderers across language." Indeed, in the same way as James Baldwin and Toni Morrison have brought a radically new understanding of the experience of and worldview of African Americans, so do, for today's displaced people, among many others, the Somali novelist Nuruddin Farah, who recounts in Yesterday Tomorrow his study of the experiences of refugees like him in Europe and Africa. Or the Irani-Afghan poet Aliye Ataye, who explains in The Border of the Forgotten her worldview about what it means to live across continents between Europe and the Middle East. Both speak in a different voice. In his reflections on exile, Edward Said wrote that, quote, "The difference between earlier exiles and those of our time is that it bears stressing scale. Our age is indeed the age of the refugee, the displaced person, mass immigration," unquote. Since he made this comment, the number of persons of concern in the technocratic language of the High Commissioner for Refugees, that is displaced person of all kinds, has increased tenfold. Beyond their number, they represent a unique form of life in contemporary societies, to use Wittgenstein's notion, which has recently been, so to speak, refurbished into a concept. This form of life is characterized, beyond the tribulation they live through, by a distinct expression of resistance, invisible and silent to misfortune and abuse, not a resistance against power, but a resistance for life. The perseverance to reach a place where they can stop and find some protection. Work remains to be done by critical theory with this combination of social pathology of recognition and minuscule but decisive resistance to adversity or any other concept. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Didier, for this illuminating and very rich paper, which, of course, because it is so rich, is difficult to comment. The other difficulty is that I agree with most of what you said. And in particular, because you try to do what Robin Silicates has asked us to do yesterday evening, try to see like a migrant, or as you call it, a displaced person. Therefore, my comment will refer to 2 points which are already mentioned in the paper, but which, according to my understanding, are in need of more emphasis and elaboration, which you couldn't have done, of course, within 30 minutes. So my comment is a bit unfair. The first comment is about the scope and frame of what we see or should see if we try to see like a migrant, what we should take into account and what not. And the second part of my comment is about the meaning and role of choice in the ethnographic description and in the public discourse about displacement. So the first comment, or first part of the comment. Didier begins and ends his presentation with the question why the early critical theorists did not pay much attention to stateless and forced displacement. In distinction, for example, to Hannah Arendt, and why they, to quote from his paper, did not allow space in their theories to include the displaced populations of their time, although they belonged to this group and were affected by prosecution and displacement. Didier assumes that one of the possible reasons could be kind of elitist self-understanding. I would like to try a different answer, which also then leads to the main point of my comment. Perhaps they didn't pay so much attention because they were more interested in analyzing and explaining the social, economic, and cultural structures and processes which forced them to leave. To put it in a nutshell, for example, with Max Horkheimer's essay on Jews and Europe, published in 1939. The primary reason for the refugees to leave Europe was fascism, but in order to understand and explain fascism, one must, as Horkheimer said, go back to consider the tendencies within capitalism. Capitalism is the reason for fascism. To quote Horkheimer, now, as predicted, the contradictions of technical progress have created a permanent economic crisis, and the descendants of the free entrepreneurs can maintain their positions only by the abolition of bourgeois freedoms. Hence, Horkheimer's famous conclusion, but whoever is not willing to talk about capitalism should also keep quiet about fascism. This reproach, by the way, was directed against those intellectuals among the refugees who gave up their Jewish Hegelian jargon of international solidarity, of the working class, and critique of capitalism. Instead of this, as Horkheimer says, with a sigh of relief, they throw away the troublesome weapon and turn to neo-humanism, to Goethe's personality, to the true Germany and other cultural assets. Against this, Horkheimer is quite clear. The totalitarian order differs from its bourgeois predecessor only in that it has lost its inhibitions. Now, I would like to take this perspective when I turn to Didier's paper again. Didier begins his observations and his analysis with the fact of displacement, and, of course, with good reasons, describes the form of life of displaced people and the politics of life exercised by the states which treat them by physical threat and dehumanizing practices at the borders and by externalizing border control to non-European countries. This is, of course, an accurate description. But, and this is my first question, does this approach pay enough attention to the reasons and causes of the displacement in the beginning? Didier only briefly tells us, for example, quote, that they had been persecuted in their home country for their ethnicity, their religion, their sexual orientation, or their political opposition, or that they experience at or beyond the borders the same denial of who they are as the one they previously experienced in their country, which was the source of their persecution. If I try to see like a migrant, I would say that the decision to leave is not easy, even if I or my family is threatened with persecution and killing. Because I have to leave the form of life in which I grew up, my relations with family, friends, neighbors, a shared language and culture. If so, we have to include in our picture the question which structures and processes caused a situation which forces me to leave and not to stay. Raising this question is of course dangerous because it could nurture the populist narrative that Europe should not be made responsible for the trouble in Africa, Syria, or Afghanistan, and consequently, we have no reason to welcome the displaced persons who flee these troubles. But, as we know, this narrative is false. Because, and here I would like to turn back to Horkheimer, it is global capitalism which is the main reason for the trouble. Analogous to Horkheimer, one could say, whoever is not willing to talk about capitalism should also keep quiet about corrupt regimes, tribalism, exploitation, poverty, economic failures, religious wars, and terrorist attacks in Africa and elsewhere. Didier indicates this when he says, with regard to the externalization of the dehumanizing border regime, I quote, neocolonization of Africa by the EU or the individual European countries such as France, Britain, and Italy via the soft power of money and influence concerns many other countries on the continent. It is not indifferent that these have natural resources such as oil, gas, uranium, and other minerals, the exploitation of which benefits European companies and local authorities in a win-win game based on corruption at the expense of both national and displaced populations. End of quote. I think that this is not only true for the current practice of the externalization of border control, but also for the general relationship between Europe and these countries. As Stefan Lessenich has pointed out, our wealthy form of life with sacralization of life as a value, our wealthy form of life depends also on the externalization of exploitation, of cheap labor, extraction of raw materials, waste, and so on in these countries. The politics of life in Western Europe, which considers life and human dignity as highest values, is based on the devaluation of life and a politics of indignity in the poor countries. And it is a part of the politics of life in Europe now that populist politics tries to play a zero-sum game between displaced persons and those people who live in a precarious life here and now, by pretending that migrants would take their jobs away, take advantages of the welfare system at the expense of the precarious and get more political attention. This, of course, is nothing else than an externalization of the inequality and injustice between the wealthy and the poor people, which we have in our own form of life through the relationship between the latter and the migrants. It causes envy, hate, and aggression, and leads to more dehumanization on both sides. To sum up my first comment, I would like to say that this has to be included in a comprehensive picture if we try to see like a migrant and to analyze the political violence of borders. It is a task in the best Horkheimerian tradition for future critical theory and already included in the research program. Second comment, the matter of choice. When Didier looks at the stories which he collected in his ethnography, he talks about there was no alternative than to leave, no other choice, no other option. In his book on life, A Critical User's Manual, Didier speaks of Zwangsnomaden, or forced nomads. For example, in his presentation today, the young man from Nigeria, I quote, "Obviously, this young man had thought he had no other choice than leaving his village, and as he lived near the northern border of Nigeria, no other option than going to a supposedly safer Niger." Or another quote, he is looking to people in search of protection or a better life. So I would like to ask for the meaning of having no other choice, no other option, and being in search of something different, a better life. And I would ask you to elaborate a bit more on the intricate relationship between force and choice, because I think it's important for the following reasons. It seems obvious that the circumstances under which, for example, the young man in Nigeria decided to leave describe a situation where he had no other choice. But nevertheless, it is his choice, even if it is a difficult choice, a choice which nobody makes without reflection and deliberation. If we look at the stories of Jewish migrants in Germany in the 30s and 40s, and the countries which were occupied by German forces, we can see how many of them tried to stay as long as possible and often waited too long to avoid deportation in a concentration camp. I think it is important to keep that in mind, because otherwise it could lead to the wrong picture that, for example, the young man in Nigeria was only driven by threatening circumstances, that he was a victim of bad circumstances, who is even more victimized when he becomes dehumanized by the border control regimes. Of course, these are correct descriptions, I don't deny that. But I think it is necessary to attribute agency and to view to him and to view his decision as an act and expression of taking responsibility for his own life and of his family. Perhaps this is also important to retain dignity, even under these devastating circumstances. On the other hand, again, there is a danger in doing this. To consider his decision to leave and not to stay as a choice, even under aggravated circumstances of force, could lead to a kind of responsibilization for all the bad consequences he has to suffer by displacement. And Didier already indicated that in his presentation. It could lead to the false conclusion that the dehumanization and devaluation of life is justified by being a foreseeable consequence of their choice to leave. So if they can be made responsible for a wrong choice, you can treat them as you like, because they are responsible for what they suffer. As often, there is a complicated borderline in the institution of responsibility between empowerment and discipline. Perhaps this could also be an example for the contradictions between what Didier calls ethics of life and politics of life. Responsibility is probably an essential part of an ethics of life, but can be abused by a politics of life as a justification for unequal treatment. For example, that the poor deserve their status because they are responsible for wrong choices in their life, or in criminal law, as you can imagine. So my question would be, in what sense is the language of choice and option for one's own life, or taking options, making options for one's own life, an essential element of the form of life? The ethic and the politics of life. So which role plays a responsibility in the ethics and politics of life? Perhaps I would like to anticipate Didier's answer. The answer lies in Didier's concluding remarks. And I hope I quote them correctly from the previous version of your paper, which I had. By a distinct expression of resistance, invisible and silent to misfortune and abuse, not a resistance against, but a resistance for the perseverance to reach a place where they can stop and find some protection. Resistance, above all, resistance for something, I think is only possible when it is deliberately chosen. Thank you.
Does it work now? Yeah, I guess so. So thank you very much for the inspiring lecture and the comment which is highlighting some more questions regarding the politics of life, ethics of life. So first of all, you have the chance to answer to the comments and questions. Klaus Günther Rose, and then the floor is open for other questions from the audience.
Thank you very much for your very fine analysis and discussion of my paper. I should start by saying that, as I said at the very beginning of my lecture, that I'm humbled by your knowledge and starting point with Horkheimer's text. So this is my description of the first generation being confronted to exile and not being so much interested in displaced population. Was a way of trying to provoke, but you're right in referring to Horkheimer here. Now, I should say that except at the very end, I would not have the pretension to be seen as a migrant. Even if I try to describe situations, but at least in this paper, this is not what I could pretend or assume that I was doing. But I think you're right in posing the question of how difficult the decision is, and to leave. And in fact, it is very difficult when we did 90 interviews in depth of people who had left their country from the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, or Maghreb. And the decisions are very different depending on the context. And people leaving Afghanistan, for example, they were really on immediate pressure to leave, and because members of their family around them had been killed, and they have been threatened personally, and so they left. This is a little what happened with this man from Nigeria, although he's in a very difficult, very distinct context, because he's not someone who has been engaged in any politics, whereas many of those who leave Iran or Afghanistan or Syria also have been involved in many different ways in politics. So when I say in this case he had no other option, that is, as you understood well, that is in reaction against this common talk about displaced people, which is to say, if they knew how difficult it would be, they would not have left, as if they had really a choice in these cases. Now, you have these situations, and you have other situations which are very different, when it is a completely assumed choice after a month of raising money because of situation of poverty that is unbearable, and even when there's a choice of living where you live, doesn't mean that you want to go to Europe. Many of the people we've talked to would have liked to stay and did stay either in Turkey for those who were coming from the east, or in Algeria or Morocco trying to work, and could have stayed if they had not been harassed, deported, or threatened to be deported. So you're right in insisting on the fact that very often it is difficult to take for granted the reconstruction of what people say about the reason why they left, and this is famously Bourdieu's biographical illusion. And so in some case, I think this language, I took the language of choice, and of no other choice and no other option, when in fact there are still other options, maybe not so much in terms of choice of living, but in terms of where to live. In Cameroon, for example, more than 90% of those who leave their country go to either Nigeria or Chad. They don't go they don't have the money to go to the north. So, yeah, so I think, and that's, we just finished a book which is an ethnography of these situations of exiles, and we show many different situations, and this one of this Nigerian man was one that was that allowed to show all along the road the complexity, but also the implications of this global capitalism you were talking about. The fact that the fact that in all the countries where the European countries, either as such or as European Union, intervene, especially in Africa, but we know that it's true also in the Middle East. There's an association of both stopping immigration and benefiting from the local resources. So it is, I mentioned it in passing or too quickly probably here, but this neo-colonization is, and in the case of the Middle East, even before the there was a colonization, but after that, there's an imperial project of control of the region. So it is important to underline, as you did, the global dimension, which I think is not only capitalist, but it's also imperialist in a different sense. Thank you very much for your very useful comments.
Okay. As time goes by, we don't have very much time left for discussions, but still, I want to collect, I would make some rounds. Okay. First, in the back, and I collect 2 questions, one here and then one here. The micro is coming.
Yeah, hello, thank you. I'm Claudia Wiesner, I'm a professor of European integration. So I teach about the Europe that you have been talking about. I would like to congratulate you on your lecture. I think it's very fitting. I would have a number of questions I would love to discuss really further on, but let me frame it into 2 questions. So in your analysis, who is the driving force behind the dark and frightening regime that you were describing? Is it European countries? Is it the European Union? And what does what you have been describing mean for the European Union in terms of a normative, moral or systematic judgment? Thank you.
Okay, the second question is over there in the 3rd row on the left side.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the lecture. I was really moved by it, and I really appreciate that you put the question of borders on our agenda. I was then a bit surprised at the end when you used Axel Honnold's concepts of recognition and social pathology to describe precisely this kind of injustice, especially because I think that Axel's work is so much dependent on holding on to the nation state, the concept of the nation state, and I think he is completely unwilling and also unable, conceptually unable to give up the nation state. So why not look at other sources of critique and also of challenging the border regime? I mean, if you look at, for example, early on Angela Davis's work, who was a student of Marcuse and Adorno, and her work on fugitivity, if you look at Marxist scholarship on autonomy of migration, who understand, migration and escape as forms of labor struggle. The works of border abolitionist thinkers, Hasha Valia and others, who use an abolitionist framework to pursue a no-border politics. So if we cross a more narrow conception of critical theory and have a broader conception of critical theory, wouldn't we then be able to come up with a more productive and maybe also more radical envisioning of possible alternative to this violence?
Okay, there's another one here. You could raise the hand. Yeah.
Thank you. One question for Didier Fassin. You said that you try to avoid psychologizing the collective, and in what I would like to ask, in what sense do you say like this? Because why I ask the question? Because when you do sociology of culture, including sociology of knowledge, you need some aspect of collective and psychology, and including this and anthropology. Anthropological research must take also this into consideration in general, especially when we would try to make general anthropology. So why do you try to avoid this? Yeah.
Thank you very much for your question. So is it the European Union or certain countries in Europe? It is both, obviously. We know that, and I gave examples of both, in fact. It is clear that the European Union has been a driving force, but behind the European Union you have the European countries, and it has been the case, I think, for the last at least 20 years that the resolutions at the level of the European Union have always been for the worse. I mean, that is by which I mean the country which has the toughest position is the one who will define the line. We've seen that very clearly after the Aquarius case situation that I mentioned at the beginning. There was a threat by you probably remember the Minister of the Interior to make an alliance with the Italian and Austrian ministers to have convergence, and there was a call for a meeting was convened to define with the I think at the time 28 countries what should be the policy, and the policy was aligned at the time on Matteo Salvini's demands, and Matteo Salvini came out of this meeting, which lasted 2 days, with the ministers of the interior of the countries, and said, "We're happy, we got what we wanted." And this has been a continuous, if you take the maximum length of detention in detention center, you can take many examples. It has been always the toughest country defining the line for, not always, but very often defining the line of the EU. So it's both, and in certain cases it's, for example, in the Libyan case, there was a personal thing about Italy, Britain, and France with Libya, for example. In the former colonies of France, as we see now, with the rejection of France, we see that it is countries which are individually intervening. So I think there's both, and in terms of individual countries, it is very much, obviously, very much linked to their colonial history and the influence that they keep in these countries. So I hesitated about social pathology for two reasons. One, which is, as I said, that I've always been very reluctant, even when I saw it appear in Axel Honneth's text and others, about this idea that you could pathologize. And being a physician myself, you know, perhaps I was even more prudent in that, but the pathologization of a society as such. And that goes also with the psychologization. I don't think you can psychologize. There is a line in cultural anthropology or certain classical cultural anthropology in which there was psychological characteristic attached to certain culture. I've always been against that. In this case, the reason why, and taking some liberty with Axel's use of social pathology, I thought that if you want to take further than simply a question of, and that's what I tried in this paper, further than Fortress Europe, further than blocking immigration, but you see the kind of cruelty that is authorized, that is permitted, that is supported. You have to find another vocabulary, so maybe that was not I'm not sure, but and I would not say it's not so much the question of the pathology of societies as pathology of the social. Now, should we go to other interpretation? Why not? I'm not sure that in this case the question of no border, which I could have sympathy for personally, but I'm not sure that it would be the best way of, for me at least, to interpret. Again, there is this excess. I mentioned Georges Bataille. There is this excess that cannot be simply reduced to the political economy, even if it has a major role, as I explained, both at the level of the externalization of the border control and in the way of preventing migrants to come in while using them when they come in. So it's the inclusion-exclusion system. But I'm not. I think this is also something on which I'm happy to continue to reflect. I started by saying that the critical theory of the Frankfurt School had not been very much interested, and I tried to bring it back at the end. But there might be other ways of doing it.
Okay, we started later and we even end later. So I thank you both very much for leaving us with critical tasks and questions which we need for future.